The debt collectors of human space, the Vretch Accord, had one law older than any other, older than their ships, older than their language of trademarks and interest calculations. A debt once recorded does not die. It outlives empires. It outlives suns if the ledger is copied carefully enough. The Vretch had built an entire civilization on this principle, and in 4,000 years of expansion across the outer spiral, they had never once been wrong to trust it. Species rose, species fell. Species borrowed in desperation and forgot in comfort. The Vretch collectors watched it happen again and again, patient as erosion, because a debt was not a threat. It was a bet on the future, a bet that whoever you helped today would still be someone tomorrow who remembered being helped. Most of the time they lost that bet. That was simply the cost of doing business with the young races. This is the story of the one time they didn't. Not for a long time anyway. It started with a man named Aldous Kepler, and it started badly, the way most good stories do. The year, by the reckoning of the colony world HFY, was 112 years after founding. Aldous Kepler was 41 years old, a maintenance engineer on the edge of a settlement that had not yet decided whether it would survive its second decade. He was walking the outer perimeter fence at 300 hours, checking a coolant line that kept freezing in the planet's long black winter when he found the wreck. It wasn't a crash so much as a controlled failure. A Vretch courier vessel, small and spindly, its landing gear crumpled from a hard touchdown, its hull scorched from something that had chased it a long way before giving up. Aldous had never seen an alien ship before. Nobody on HFY had. First contact was still 11 years in the future by the official record, and here was contact, unofficial, unrecorded, and dying in a snowbank 40 meters from the fence line. The creature that crawled out of the wreckage did not look like anything Aldous had a word for. Long-limbed, chitinous along the spine, with a face built for reading ledgers rather than expressing emotion. And it was, by every metric a human engineer could improvise, with a suit thermometer and a flashlight, freezing to death. Aldous Kepler did not call this in. There was no one to call. HFY's tiny garrison was 11 hours from waking, and the creature would not last 11 hours. So he did what a maintenance engineer does when something is broken and no one is coming to help. He fixed what he could reach. He dragged the alien into his own coolant shed, which was heated if barely. He gave it the blanket off his own cot. He siphoned 3 days' worth of his personal water ration into a cracked bowl because he had no idea what it drank, and erred on the side of the only thing he knew kept things alive. He sat with it through the black HFY night, not because he expected anything, but because leaving would have meant listening to it die through the shed wall, and he found he could not do that. By morning, the creature's breathing had steadied. Size 6 of them, arranged in a way that made Aldous slightly dizzy to look at, directly opened and fixed on him. It spoke. Not in words he understood, not yet, but its translator implant, waterlogged and sparking, caught up within the hour, stuttering into function just long enough to render one sentence with perfect mechanical clarity. You have extended me resources with no assurance of return. This is recorded. This will be repaid. Aldous, exhausted, half-frozen himself, had laughed. Don't worry about it, he said. Just get home safe. Vretch, whose name, translated roughly and much later, came out as something like Letterkeeper Third Rank Asen, did not laugh. Vretch physiology made laughing difficult, but more than that, Vretch culture made the idea itself difficult. A debt was not a joke. A debt was a promise made visible. You misunderstand, Asen said, with the patience of someone explaining gravity to a child. It is not a matter of worry. It is a matter of record. I will repay you, or my line will, or my nation will, when my line is gone. This is not generosity on my part. This is law. Aldous shrugged, because he was tired and it was still snowing, and none of this seemed particularly important next to the fact that he needed to be back at the coolant line before his shift log flagged an absence. Sure, he said. Whatever you say, buddy. He gave Asen directions to the nearest flat ground for an emergency beacon, helped him drag a functioning transmitter out of the wreck, and went back to work. He mentioned it to no one because he suspected no one would believe him, and because this was the part he'd tell his grandchildren later. When it became a favorite bedtime story, it hadn't felt like the kind of thing you did for credit. It had felt like the kind of thing you just did. Asen recorded the debt anyway. Vretch law required it, and more than that, Vretch law required something Aldous Kepler could not have anticipated. The debt did not expire. It did not transfer to some impersonal state fund to be quietly written off. It followed the Kepler bloodline, encoded into the vast, slow-turning bureaucracy of Vretch interstellar record-keeping, waiting for the moment it could be discharged in full, to Aldous, or failing that, to whoever carried his name and his blood forward through time. The Vretch collectors who eventually inherited the file did not expect much. They never did with the young races. Humanity would forget within 2 generations the way everyone forgot. The debt would sit in the ledger, technically active, practically dead, One more entry in an archive of promises nobody remembered making. They were wrong, and it took them 300 years to fully understand how wrong. Contact came officially 11 years after Aldous Kepler's shift on the perimeter fence, and it came badly, a border skirmish over a resource claim, two frightened species posturing at each other across an asteroid belt until someone made a mistake and 31 people died before anyone worked out how to say stop in the other's language. It was not humanity's finest hour, and it was not the Vretch's either. But in the chaos of the peace treaty that followed, a mid-level Vretch archivist noticed something odd in the settlement records. The debt holder listed as origin for one very old, very small, very strange entry, a debt owed to Aldous Kepler of HFY, was a human. It should have been discharged by then or forgotten or transferred to a state fund. It was neither. It was sitting exactly where Asen had left it, waiting. The Vretch sent an inquiry through diplomatic channels, more out of bureaucratic thoroughness than expectation. Did the human government wish to claim, on behalf of the Kepler bloodline, discharge of an outstanding debt originating 123 years prior? The reply took 4 months to arrive, because it had to travel down through HFY's tangled colonial government, then to a records office, then to an actual living Kepler, Aldous's great-granddaughter, a woman named Priya Kepleros who ran a hydroponics cooperative and had never once in her life heard the story, because her great-grandfather had, true to form, never mentioned it to anyone who mattered. Her reply, when it came, confused the Vretch archivists considerably. "Tell them not to worry about it," she wrote, "but thank them for asking. This should have ended it." By every model of behavior the Vretch had built from 4,000 years of contact with dozens of species, a debt offered and declined was a debt closed. The polite thing, the correct thing, was to mark the file discharged by waiver and move on, except the file did not close. Because 3 years later, when a Vretch supply convoy was ambushed by pirates near the edge of human territory, and one damaged vessel limped, alone and unescorted, into range of a human border station, the station commander, a woman who happened to be Priya Kepleros's daughter and had grown up after all, hearing the story her mother had somehow decided to tell her own children even if she hadn't cared to collect on it herself, gave the order without hesitation. Full repair cruise, full fuel transfer, priority docking, no charge, no questions. The Vretch pilot, stunned and grateful, asked why. The station commander, Naledi Keplerosi, 28 years old, unimpressed with the question, told her the story of a coolant shed on HFY and said simply, "Family keeps track of these things." That was the moment the Vretch stopped thinking of the Kepler debt as an anomaly and started thinking of it as a data point. It should be understood by anyone hearing this story cold that the Vretch were not sentimental. Their culture did not run on stories the way human culture did. It ran on ledgers, on records, on the cold, load-bearing architecture of promises kept because keeping them was the only thing that let civilizations trust each other across the unfathomable gulf of interstellar distance, where no court could ever truly enforce anything, and every transaction was, in the end, an act of faith backed by nothing but reputation. Vretch had built an empire on the wager that reputation mattered more than force, and the young races, the loud ones, the fast ones, the ones who burned through a generation's memory in a single lifetime, kept failing that wager over and over, until the Vretch simply stopped extending real trust to anyone who hadn't proven, through centuries of consistency, that they could hold it. Humanity, in the first 100 years after contact, gave the Vretch every reason to expect the usual failure. There were wars. There were 3 separate human governments that rose and fell and rose again in the span of a single Vretch archivist's career. There was a period of almost 40 years when human space was so fractured that no single authority could even confirm whether the original debt file was still considered valid by whichever splinter government currently held nominal jurisdiction over HFY's records. And still, the debt did not die. It moved instead, quietly and formally, the way family stories move from Priya to Naledi's son Thomas, who joined the Merchant Marine and once spent 6 months of his own salary rerouting a Vretch relief shipment through a war-zone corridor because the Vretch have been decent to us since before I was born, and my great-great-grandfather started that, and I'm not going to be the Kepler who lets it drop. Thomas never once framed it as debt collection. Neither had any of them. To every Kepler who inherited the story, it had never once felt like an obligation. It felt like a family trait, the way some families pass down a recipe or a temper or a particular way of telling a joke. The Keplers passed down a reflex. When a Vretch needed help, you helped because that was what Keplers did, the same instinctive shrug their ancestor had given a dying alien in a snowbank 112 years after founding. By the time the debt reached its 5th generation, a data analyst named Ren Kepler working entirely by coincidence for the joint Human-Vretch Trade Commission on a station called Halcyon Reach. The Vretch had started keeping a second file, not the original debt ledger, which by any reasonable accounting had been discharged a dozen times over by then, informally, unofficially, through 100 small acts nobody on the human side had ever bothered to log. The second file was different. The second file was a study, its formal Vretch designation translated roughly to anomalous persistence of voluntary reciprocity across 5 generations unincentivized. Its informal name, which spread through Vretch archival circles the way informal names do, was simply the Kepler question. The Kepler question was this: why did they keep doing it? There was no enforcement mechanism. There was no institutional memory forcing compliance, no contract, no court, no threat of consequence for simply letting the debt lapse the way every other species eventually let every other debt lapse. There was, as far as the Vretch could determine after 2 centuries of watching, nothing at all compelling the Kepler line to keep helping Vretch ships and Vretch crews except the fact that, once, a man named Aldous had sat up all night in a coolant shed with a dying stranger because leaving felt worse than staying. Asen, the original ledger keeper, alive still, because Vretch lifespans ran to 900 years, and he had spent most of the intervening 2 centuries slowly rising through the ranks of the Accord's archival division, in no small part because of the professional curiosity the Kepler file had sparked in him, took a personal interest in the question that eventually became something closer to obsession. He requested and was granted assignment as senior observer to the Halcyon Reach trade mission, specifically so he could, at long last, meet a Kepler. He found Ren Kepler Rake on a maintenance deck, of all places, elbow-deep in a coolant regulator that had frozen solid in Halcyon Reach's notoriously unreliable environmental system, muttering at it in a tone of weary, familiar frustration that Asen, who had, after all, spent one very long night listening to a human do exactly this kind of muttering 200 years before, found so specifically uncannily familiar that he stood in the doorway for a full minute before he found the composure to speak. "You are repairing a coolant line," he said, and it came out stranger than he intended, thick with 2 centuries of accumulated significance that the young woman in front of him had absolutely no context for. Ren didn't look up. "Story of my life, you need something or you just here to watch?" "I am here," Asen said carefully, "to close a file." That got her attention. She sat back on her heels, wiped a smear of coolant gel off her hands, and gave him the particular look humans give when they suspect they're being told a joke they haven't been let in on yet. "What file?" "So," he told her. "All of it, the wreck, the snowbank, the blanket, the ration of water." The sentence he'd spoken through a sparking translator that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation the Vretch collector culture had ever built, turned out to be true 5 generations running. He told her about Priya's polite refusal and Naletti's docking bay and Thomas's rerouted shipment, about a second file that had grown over 2 centuries, into the single most cited case study in the Accord's entire archival division, about a term, the Kepler question, that had genuinely become a subject Vretch trade cadets studied before their first posting to human space, because their instructors wanted them to understand that reciprocity without enforcement was not, in fact, a theoretical impossibility. It had a name, it had a bloodline, it had apparently a maintenance deck on Halcyon Reach and a coolant regulator that needed fixing. Ren listened to the whole thing in silence, which for Kepler was itself something of a family record. "So," she said when he'd finished, "you came all this way to tell me my great-great-great-grand had helped some guy who was freezing to death, and it turned into what homework? For your whole species." "Turned into evidence," Asen said, "that trust between our people was possible on a timescale we had never before observed to be sustainable. Every debt we have ever extended to a young species has decayed within 3 generations. Yours did not decay, it transformed. It became something your people did without needing the ledger at all." He paused, and something in his long, careful face that Ren would later swear looked almost like uncertainty. "I have spent 200 years trying to determine why. I would like if you are willing to finally ask the source directly. Why did your family keep the dead alive when nothing compelled you to?" Ren considered this for a long moment, wiping her hands properly this time, looking not at Asen but at the coolant regulator she'd been fighting with for the better part of an hour. "I don't think we did," she said finally. "Keep a dead alive, I mean. Nobody in my family ever once said, 'Hey, we owe the Vretch.' That's not how Nana told it. She used to tell us the story like it was a, I don't know, a compass heading. Like this is a direction you can point yourself in when you're not sure what the right thing is. Somebody was freezing, somebody helped, that's it, that's the whole rule. It's not about you specifically or your species specifically or paying anybody back for anything. She shrugged in a gesture so precisely, unknowingly identical to the one Aldous Kepler had made in a coolant shed 200 years earlier, that Asen felt something in his ancient, letter-trained mind quietly, permanently reorganize itself. It's just if somebody's freezing and you can help, you help. My family's just been lucky enough that the somebody kept being you guys generation after generation. That's not us keeping a promise to your accord. That's just us being who we are. The debt thing is just what you called it on your side. Asen was quiet for a long time, long enough that Ren, uncomfortable, went back to the regulator and had it running again before he finally spoke. On behalf of the Vretch Accord, he said, I am formally discharging the debt of Aldous Kepler in full as of this date. Ren snorted not unkindly. Cool, took you long enough. Also, Asen continued, and here his voice did something that no translator implant had ever quite managed to render before, something that came out not as data but as something startlingly, unmistakably close to warmth. Requesting on my own behalf and not the Accord's permission to open a new file. Unofficial. No ledger, no repayment clause. He hesitated in the particular way of a 900-year-old bureaucrat encountering an emotion his species had no proper accounting category for. I would like to know you, not the debt, you. Ren Keplerake looked up from the regulator, coolant gel still drying on her knuckles, and found herself doing something her great-great-great-grandfather had done in a snowbank 2 centuries before her, in a shed with no witnesses and no reason to expect it would ever matter to anyone. She shrugged and smiled and said the same 4 words that had started the whole impossible, unenforceable, quietly extraordinary chain of it. Sure, whatever you say. Kepler's question was never fully answered, not in any way the Vretch Archival Division ever managed to encode into a ledger. But it did eventually get a footnote added to its file, added by Asen himself in the last decade of his very long life, in a hand shaky with age and something that was not quite grief and not quite joy but sat somewhere comfortable between the two. The footnote read in its entirety. Some debts are not meant to be closed. They are meant to be carried forward freely by people who were never keeping score in the first place. This is not a flaw in the ledger. This is the discovery the ledger was built to make possible. 5 generations after that, when the first joint human-Vretch colony ship launched from Halcyon Reach with a crew list that included, by unremarkable coincidence, a systems engineer named Kepler and a senior archivist whose family name, translated loosely, meant something like keeper of small kindnesses, nobody on board thought to mention the coolant shed at all. They didn't need to. It was already load-bearing, threaded so deep into who both families.